Luke chapter 12, 13 through 15. It reads, someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man who is the judge and over you. And he said to him, Take care and on the guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in abundance of his possessions.
We have a victory in Jesus this morning. Amen. Brother Orman, thank you for leading us in our focus, in our singing, our praise to God. We have that victory in Jesus because we are leaning on the everlasting arms of Jesus. And I was thankful for those songs being placed together, and especially with the mentality that we're doing that just over in the glory land. That's the focus for us this morning. And as Joseph read for us in the scripture reading, there was someone who was not focused on the victory that was in Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms. He was leaning on arms that could grow weak. He was leaning on an inheritance, causing his arms to actually be put up and fight against his own brother. He was focused on something completely worldly when he's in the presence of Jesus, in the presence of his victory. And so we talked about this last week. We talked about this line of communication between us and God. And it's like that idea of the can that you have two little tin cans and you have a string between it. And it has that picture of God speaking into the can and us listening and us speaking His words. His words, His whisper is meant to be expressed. Luke 12:3 establishes that. What has been whispered in the room must be explained or proclaimed from the rooftop. And we discussed three different things that stopped us, or they were scissors that literally cut that line of communication between us and God. The first one being false teaching. Remember, Jesus said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's talking about the teachings that would go against the kingdom of heaven. And so that false teaching is literally what's going to cause you to be afraid for speaking the truth. And he said, don't fear those who can kill the body but can't touch your soul. So fear is another reason that we would cut off that line of communication. And the third one was apathy, and that's based on the reading that Joseph read for us in verse 13. When Jesus gets done explaining the purpose, the commission that he's going to make for all of his children, you have a man who says, that's all well and good, but what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for me? How are you going to help me? And it was all about apathy. That would literally cut off the line of communication between us and God. We talked about the reasons, these three reasons why we would cut that line, but I want us to discuss the consequence, and there's 5 of them. And briefly, we're going to focus on them is the consequence of cutting off the whisper from God. The first place is we're left with sin. If we cut off the line of communication between us and God, we're literally left with this empty can in our ear. And remember, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. If we're not going to hear the word of Christ anymore, we're going to have an emptiness, and it's going to be left with sin. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, as was just read in verse 13 and following, you have this guy that is just completely focused on a fight, a quarrel between him and his brother, and he wants a judge, an arbitrator, and he thinks Jesus can be that for him. I loved our class focus this in the auditorium this morning, and John Gallagher mentioned how there were people from every walk of life who were coming to follow Jesus, and with that, they had every purpose under the sun as to why they were there. This man chose a selfish purpose as to why he was there. I'm thankful he was there. And so what's powerful is he gets to hear the words of Jesus. Jesus is able to take him from where he is to where he needs to be, and that's how he helps us. I don't know where you are this morning, but I'm so thankful that you're here striving to learn a message from God's word, that you're here to worship God in that victory we have in Jesus. But notice Jesus' response in verse 15, the first part. He then told them, watch out and be on guard against all greed. You might have covetousness. The word literally means trying to get something more than what you're due. And so he says this in response to this man saying, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Jesus has just said what you hear whispered in the room, explain on the rooftop. And this man is more focused on the rooftop and who owns it. And so this is interesting. He says, don't be greedy. So obviously he's wanting more than what is coming to him. And he thinks Jesus can be a lawyer to get it for him and get more than what's coming to him. That's also interesting that that word is found in a list of sins that separate us from God. In Romans chapter 1, if you'll turn there with me, in fact, man, verse 18 is powerful because it says that the wrath of God is waiting from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. And so there's this desire to suppress truth. We don't want to listen to truth because why? Truth causes us to have to change. And so if I would cut off the line between God and me, I'm cutting off truth and I'm left with sin. Verse 28 says, and because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, they being those who would suppress the truth, they didn't see it worthwhile to acknowledge God. That's snip. God delivered them over to a corrupt mind so that they do what is not right. They're filled with all unrighteousness, evil, greed. There's our word that Jesus warned the people about based on what this man said to Jesus. So greed is part of this. Greed is evil, but it's all unrighteousness. What else? It says, and wickedness. They are full of envy, murder, quarrels. So obviously there's a quarrel between him and his brother, right? It says malice. They're gossips. Well, is his brother there? He's throwing his brother under the bus, trying to get his way. And maybe his brother's not there. He's causing a gossip situation between him and his brother with Jesus. He's trying to pull Jesus into the midst of it. Slanderers. He's slandering his brother. He's not being fair. God haters. Arrogant, proud, boastful, inventors of evil. And I think this is interesting, verse 30. And on Wednesday, we heard this about, two Wednesdays ago, about children obeying your parents, honoring your father and your mother. It says disobedient to parents. It doesn't seem like that should be in a list with murder. That doesn't seem like it should be in a list of inventors of evil or slanderers. But what's interesting is someone who disobeys their parents is literally disobeying the first line of communication concerning right and wrong. And if you're going to disobey that first line, you're going to disobey that next line. If you're going to disobey your father on earth, you will disobey your Father who is in heaven. And so it is extremely important. It is vital for our children to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 31, senseless, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. Verse 32, although they know God's just sentence, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they even applaud others who practice them. Why would those who have severed the line of communication between them and God, why would they applaud those who practice such things? Because misery loves company. Misery loves company. If someone's made the decision to cut off the line of communication between them and God, they don't want anybody communicating what God would tell them to do. How else do you suppress the truth? If you cut off the line, you've got to cut everybody else's line in your path because you have to suppress the truth. And that causes sin to just get worse and worse and worse. And so that brings us to sin. Not only are we left with our own sin when we cut off that line between us and God, but we're also left with just ourselves. We're left with me, myself, and I. Back in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15, the second part to it, says he then told them, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possession. The word here for one's life, it's someone who it's he himself alone. Literally how that would translate. he himself alone. So this man, after Jesus speaks this incredible lesson, is surrounded by a crowd of disciples, but he's also surrounded by a crowd of followers who've just been fed, who've just seen miracles. And he decides to speak up, he himself alone. Nobody else is saying this. And it's all about him. I thought that was interesting. When we cut off our line of communication, we say, Jesus, that's all well and good, but how does that apply to me? I'm cutting off myself from everybody and from God, and I'm left on my own. But what does that do for you and for me? By cutting ourselves off from God and leaving us alone, David understood what this looked like, because even though he was a man after God's own heart, he allowed his heart to lead him down the wrong path. And this past Wednesday, we discussed about do not murder, but David did. Where he wouldn't kill Saul, but he did kill Uriah. And so the concept is, when we decide that, we can do all the good things for God, but if we just say, I'm going to cut off this line of communication right now, then I'm going to just start doing some horrible things to my fellow man. Psalm 31, David speaks, and again, understood what it was like to be cut off. In verse 22, he says, in my alarm, I said, I am cut off from your sight. Wow. Was he really cut off from the sight of God? No, God saw him, but he felt cut off. Notice the next part to that verse. But you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried to you for help. Notice, because he was in alarm, it was alarming. Wait a minute, where I am in my life. When Nathan came to him and gave him that parable about the rich man who took the poor neighbor's only ewe lamb and killed it and gave it to a stranger who came into his house. He said, man, this man is going to pay 4 times what he did to this man. He said, you're the man, David. That's when the alarm sounded. That's when he began to pray to God. He began to say, God, I'm pleading. I'm crying for help. Why would he cry to God for help? So that also shows when we're cut off, alarm bells start sounding. What are those alarm bells? We'll talk about that in just a moment. Why would he pray to God for help? Because in verse 19, he says, how great is your goodness. At the first service, we sang the song, How Great Is Our God. And it was so beautiful in comparison to this. That's what we're doing in our praise to God. When we sing victory in Jesus and leaning on the everlasting arms of Jesus, we are praising him because he's a fortress of help. We need to lean on him. Because I'll tell you, when I'm leaning, I'm hurting. And I need to lean on God. But when we cut off that pillar, we fall over. So it's interesting, if you keep reading, how great is your goodness, verse 19, which you have stored up for those who fear you. In the presence of everyone you have acted for those who take refuge in you. You hide them in the protection of your presence. You conceal them in a shelter from human schemes, from quarrelsome tongues. Blessed be the Lord. You see, that list of evil and the sins, when we don't cut off the line of communication between us and God, he provides us with protection. He provides us with that safety line to pull us to safety, and we need that to protect us and shelter us from human schemes and quarrelsome tongues. Verse 21, blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his faithful love to me. In a city under siege in my alarm, I said, I'm cut off from your sight. So what I love is when we cut that off, there's still a way back. And when we go back to Scripture, we're going to see that we need to get back to it. Why? Because being cut off from God, not only does it remove our safety, not only does it remove our protection, but it's also the definition of what hell is like. Paul tells that to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 5. And I think it's interesting because there's a backdrop of persecution that's happening to the Thessalonians. They're struggling. And he wants to explain to them how bad it could be. without God. 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 5 says, "It is clear evidence of God's righteous judgment that you will be counted worthy of God's kingdom, for which you also are suffering." So the Thessalonian Christians, why are they suffering? If you'll recall, Paul, when he came to Thessalonica, there were Jews that were jealous of his teaching, and they ran him out of town. And he went from Thessalonica to Berea. And remember in Acts 17, he said that the Bereans were more noble than those of Thessalonica because they searched the Scriptures daily to see if what Paul said was so. That's noble, to question and search, say, is this false teaching or not? That helps keep that line of communication right, and it's only right that we do that. Paul says it's noble. But those of Thessalonica, there were people who listened and they became Christians. Could be the very same people that ran Paul out of town are trying to do the same to the Christians in Thessalonica. He says, you're suffering, but you're counted worthy of God's kingdom. He's saying, don't cut off your line between you and God. But it's too hard. You don't understand. This has ruined my relationship between me and my family. You know, this is just getting too hard. I'm gonna cut the line. Don't hold the line. Don't stop. Verse 6, "Since it is just for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to give relief to you who are afflicted along with us. This will take place at the revelation of the Lord Jesus Christ from heaven with his powerful angels." He's saying, don't give up. He's saying, hold on, because there's going to come a day of judgment. But there's going to come a day when you're going to be in the arms of Jesus, the everlasting arm. That's why it's everlasting arms that we're leaning on. No matter how much we lean, he's not moving. It's everlasting. Verse 8, though, says, "And when he takes vengeance with flaming fire on those who don't know God and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ." You see, the greatest enemy is Satan, and he wants us to stop speaking because he wants people to not know God. He wants people to experience that flame, but we don't. Jesus came so that people didn't have to. That's why it's so important that we're not by ourselves and that we don't keep our mouth shut, but we proclaim this message because vengeance is coming, and we don't want this on our worst enemy. Amen. Verse 9, "They will pay the penalty of eternal destruction from the Lord's presence." Away from the Lord's presence. That's what eternal destruction is. It's eternal destruction. That's that flame, that pain that will be eternal, but it's away from the presence of God. What does that do? By being away from the presence of God forever, we have no everlasting arm to lean on. But notice it says, they will pay the penalty of eternal destruction away from the Lord's presence and from his glorious strength. When you don't have access to that strength, you're going to experience weakness and pain and suffering for all eternity. We do not want to be cut off, me, myself, and I, alone, away from God. And so that's the concept. If I'm stuck in my sin, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, I fall short of that line because I cut it. That's the situation. I cut it when it was freely there for me to grab hold of. So we cut the line. We're left with sin. We're left with ourselves. But we're also left with material things. If we're not going to hold to the kingdom of heaven, then we're going to try to recreate it by kingdoms on earth. In Luke chapter 12, verse 15, back where Jesus is responding to this guy who, remember, he's all about, hey, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus responds, watch out and be on guard against all greed, because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. He says, sir, watch out, because your life is not to be wrapped up in the abundance of your possessions. The greed is wanting more than what is due to him. And he wants to steal from his brother in order to get more and get ahead in this life. It's all about material things. And it's interesting, Jesus then goes into a parable that's very familiar, and it's on the heels of what he has just said. So Jesus would often explain something, then he would give a parable to back it up. For instance, he gives this example, for instance. All right, so let's look at this, verse 16. Then he told them a parable. A rich man's land was very productive. He thought to himself, what should I do since I don't have anywhere to store my crops? All right, so I've had a great yield. This year's been amazing. I have produced more grain than I've ever produced before. Man, I don't even know where I'm going to put it all. You know, you can see him picking up the grain. Woohoo, man, this is great. This is exciting. He thought to himself, what should I do? Verse 18, I'll do this. He said, I'll tear down my barns. These are the barns that were perfectly good last year. But I'm going to tear those barns down, and I'm going to build bigger ones. And I'm going to store all my grain and my goods there. Then I'll say to myself, ooh, there's that self. He is there on his own. It's all about him, not about his poor neighbors. You know, he's all it is did he do this? Maybe he got more rain that year. What caused him to have more yield? God? God? Did he give back to God? Did he give back to God by giving to the poor who were starving? No. He gave it to a surplus. He gave it to a storehouse. He said, he gave it to himself. Then I'll say to myself, you have many goods stored up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. Live it up. You're doing great. He sounds like the prodigal son, and the father has blessed him with years. He doesn't have to work again. He doesn't have to plant another crop for years. I'm doing great. But God said to him, you fool. Wow. Wait, God, why are you saying you fool? Why are you telling me fool? You see those YouTube videos you can watch where, you know, people will be in a city and maybe they're in a car and they'll pull up next to a Ferrari. You see somebody in a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or something, and they'll ask a question, what do you do for a living? You ever heard that? What do you do for a living? Someone will explain what they do for a living. Sometimes it's I raise butterflies. I mean, how does that add up? I don't know. But you'll see, they'll want to know, why are they asking, what do you do for a living? Because they want to get a Ferrari. They want to get a Lamborghini. This is the American dream, to work, to be able to provide and to get this, the white picket fence and everything that goes with it. And so people are asking, what are you doing? Because I want to be like you. But God is saying, you fool. Why? Why? Let's keep reading. He says, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. And the things you've prepared, what things? Years of a storehouse that he tore down the old ones and built new. Years. But does he have years? He doesn't even have hours. Or a day. He doesn't have days. He has hours left. Can he eat all that in the hours? No, he can't. He can't. That's why he's foolish. This very night your life is demanded of you, and the things you've prepared, whose will they be? That's how it is with the ones who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. When we cut off that line of communication, it's all about ourselves, then that's foolhardy. It's foolish. You know, there are some, and you know, I've heard this phrase, I'm not sure where I heard this. I can't give the right accolades. But I've heard it said that you will spend all of your health to gain your wealth, only to then spend all of your wealth to regain your health. The point is, you can't take it with you. And the ultimate health for all of us is eternal life. The ultimate. And so what would he do when he's facing eternity? But God, don't you see these big storehouses? Yeah, you left it to a nephew who did nothing. And he doesn't have to work at all. And he thinks that's what it's all about. So glad my uncle died. Woohoo! That's what he thinks it's all about, material things. And it's not worth it. It's not worth it. Mark chapter 8 and verse 34. Mark chapter 8, 34. Jesus, again, he's got crowds around him, and they're all there for different reasons. Case in point, this man who thinks Jesus can be the go-between between him and his brother. Verse 34 says, calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me. How do I do that? Because Jesus did it. Jesus did that for you and for me. He was willing to literally be cut off so that we would have a line of communication between us and God, and that line would take us on to heaven. Verse 35, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. We can become so focused on saving our own lives. Man, I got to do everything. I got to make sure this is all here, and I've got to have all these ducks in a row, or I'm not going to make it. And it causes us to focus on material things. And we do that with the guise of, I got to be a good steward of what God has given me. So that means I need to be a miser, and I need to focus on what God has given. Wait a minute. That's what the rich man did. God was the one that blessed him, and yet he focused on the blessings, not the blesser. And if we do the same, we are no different than that rich man. And we are not taking up our cross daily to follow after him. Luke says daily. And if we're focusing on trying to save our life, we'll lose it in the pursuit of saving it. And we have the right. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We can pursue the American dream, but it's not going to turn into a dream. He's saying it's a nightmare. But whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. If we're willing to give up what our needs are, why? Because what's on the line? Every person has to answer before God. By cutting off that line, we're not going to be giving the right message. We might be giving the message that America wants to hear, not what they need to hear. Verse 36, for what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life or lose his soul? Again, you can't take it with you. And on the day of judgment, we'd be willing to give up everything we were pursuing just to be able to go to heaven. What would wealth look like? Oh, that was worthless. The rich man in Luke 16, all he wanted was one drop of water to cool his tongue in the flame. But when he realized he couldn't have that drop on his tongue, he said, I have 5 brothers. Please send Lazarus to my 5 brothers. He became a missionary for God. I've often used this. He became on fire for God. Seriously. And he is in that torment right now. What is he telling you? Don't come here. It's not worth it. He would have done anything to give it to Lazarus. He'd have done anything to give his life to God. But why would he not? What stops us? Verse 38, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words. See, because we fall for the false prophet, we fall for the false teaching, prosperity gospel. When we fall for that, and we fall for fear because, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, and maybe we fall into just being jaded or complacent, and it doesn't matter. Then we're ashamed of the words of Jesus. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. This Wednesday, Brian Simon is coming for our summer series, and we've been going through the 10 Commandments, learning about what's been communicated. And he's talking about adultery. And he sent me a snippet. He sent me just a teaser. And he used verse 38. Saying, if we're friendship with the world, that's adultery with God. I want to encourage you to hear what Brian has to say. He has a remarkable way of presenting it just as plain as can be. I want to encourage you to hear it. So I won't say any more about that concept. But when we cut the line, we're left with material things, but that leaves us with alarm bells. Remember I mentioned the alarm bells? The alarm bell is anxiety. The anxiety, and sometimes anxiety is going to be there because of health reasons, because of other issues that have nothing to do with this. But there are alarm bells that are there based on Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 8. Proverbs 13 and verse 8. Let me turn there very quickly. I didn't put a bookmark there. Riches are a ransom for a person's life, but a poor person hears no threat. So what's interesting is the rich man who was going to build the bigger storehouses, say he got to do that. How's he going to protect the storehouse from those grubby neighbors that might come in and take? Man, I got to protect what's me and mine, and becomes absolutely anxious over what she has. When your life is ransomed by what you have, your possessions no longer are what you possess. They now possess you. And we don't want to be someone who's possessed. We become slave to the things that we have. Let me tell you, we've learned a little bit about that this past year because we signed a dotted line to pay a mortgage in a house we can't live in since January. And our 8th payment is coming out tomorrow. And I'm sitting here going, how? Okay, I look at this and I go, okay, how can I sell it? How can I? 2 a.m. comes easy. And you can sit there. And so please know, as I'm talking about this, this has hit me right between the eyes before it's ever come out of my mouth. We can so give in to the anxieties of this life, it's not about this. We can't take it with us. And it is the biggest distraction. And Satan wins. Satan wants it. He wants us to stop. He wants us to be held ransom. Luke chapter 12 and verse 22. Jesus has just said to this man, remember, he's saying, maybe Jesus can help me be that lawyer to get more from my brother. Let me squeeze it out of my brother so that I'll be okay. I'm going to use my brother as a stepping stone. Sure, he's just a brother. But verse 22, Jesus says, then he said to his disciples, therefore. Remember, what is therefore? Therefore. He's talking about this rich fool. Do not be the rich fool. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about the body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They do not have a storeroom. They definitely don't have a barn that they've torn down to build a bigger one. See how it connects? Yet God feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than the birds? You know, sometimes our barn is not a barn, it's a 401k. Sometimes our barn is our retirement, but you can watch that go down drastically overnight, can't we? You can see the housing crisis of 2008. You can see all of those things and realize it all stopped being mine. It was never ours to begin with. Anxiety is only going to be the alarm bell to get me back to holding on to God. Are you heeding the alarm bell? Or so many times that alarm goes off and I go, snooze, snooze, snooze. And I don't listen to the alarm that God is giving me. Let's keep going. Verse 26, if then you're not able to do even a little thing, why worry about the rest? What can we do? Verse 25, can any of you add one moment to his span by worrying? Can you add one moment? I don't have enough time. Well, can you even add one more moment with your worry? No, you can't. Verse 27, consider how the wildflowers grow. They don't labor or spin thread. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was adorned like one of these. if that's how God clothes the grass which is in the field today and is thrown into the furnace tomorrow, how much more will he do for you, you of little faith? The person who would listen to the words of Jesus and say, you know what, that's all well and good, but how are you going to help me? You of little faith. Let's not be the fool of little faith. Let's learn from the examples that we find within Scripture how Jesus responded. Don't strive for what you should eat and what you should drink, verse 29, and don't be anxious, for the Gentile world eagerly seeks all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. We've got to give it to God. God knows what we need. Sometimes when we're trying to fix it, we stop praying. We stop putting our trust in God because that's our realm. No, that's when we've cut off the line of communication. God will provide in ways you never imagined. And what's amazing is when you look back on it, I want to encourage you, do a prayer journal. If you go back and look at the prayer journal, the things you wrote, go back and look at it and say, he answered that one. Wow, he answered that. That was big. He answered all of those. That's when you finish the prayer with thanksgivings. So often we do not come back and thank God for what he's done because we didn't ask in the first place. And that leaves us with the final part. If we cut off the line, we're cutting off our own heart. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 9, Paul is trying to encourage a young man to not cut off the only thing that's going to keep his heartstring going. 1 Timothy 6, 9, but those who want to be rich fall into temptation, a trap, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge people into ruin and destruction. Why would you long to be rich? Why would you do that? Because maybe you're in a bad situation. If you long for that, then that's a trap because it will then cause you to fall further. So it can always be worse. And then it's these harmful desires that will plunge people into ruin and destruction. Verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and by craving it, some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. You know, what's the root system, right, of a tree? All right, so love of money is the root of a tree, right? So if that's the foundation, then that love of money is going to come up through the root system, and it's going to come up through the trunk, out the branches. The leaves are going to be established based on that love of money, and then the fruit's going to grow. And it's going to be all kinds of evil surrounding that tree. And I want you to think about that first tree that we were told of, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And when Eve saw that fruit, that it was a delight to the eyes, it was good for food, delight to the eyes, and a desire to make one wise. She took of its fruit, and she is the first. And Adam followed, and they cut the line of communication between them and God. That communication was that they were very good, but then they saw that their nakedness was very evil, and it flipped upside down what they thought. If we sit there and we just do what we feel and what comes to our heart, we're cutting ourselves off from God. In Luke chapter 12, I realize our time is swiftly gone. But Luke 12:31, if you'll bear with me, Jesus says, but seek his kingdom, and these things will be provided for you. But notice it's not seek the kingdom first so that you get all this. Because ironically, that's still focused on all this. Seek the kingdom first and let God handle it. Seek his kingdom. Don't be afraid, little flock, because your Father delights to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Make money bags for yourselves that won't grow old, an inexhaustible treasure in heaven where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If we cut off the line of communication between us and God, all we have is sin. Ourselves, just absolutely cut off from God. We have anxiety. Our heart is cut off. But when we recognize, because that's where our heart is, it's where the treasure. What happens when we recognize this? In Acts chapter 2 and verse 36, when the children of Israel are hearing Peter And he says that, let all the house of Israel know for certain this Jesus whom you crucified is Lord and Christ. So when they heard this, they were cut to the heart. Why? Because they had cut him down. They literally cut off their only line of communication between them and God. God with us was no longer with them. And they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? He said that line can come back. Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness of your sins. The sin of cutting off the line in the first place can be healed. Are you going to respond in the same way to what they did? There were many on that day who walked away. 3,000 responded. They were baptized that day. We have an invitation we're offering to make sure that you are not cut off from the presence of God. Will you come back to the Lord if you need it? While together we stand and while we sing.